So the paralyzed man is introduced to us in this story, and that's in verse 18. Some men were carrying on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and all three of the Gospels use some kind of form of this word that is fairly well just transliterated, and we get paralytic. Now, the idea of being lame has a kind of a well-established Old Testament tradition. The lame are sometimes used to describe people who are disqualified for priesthood, like in Leviticus chapter 21. Sometimes we see notes about how the lame are disqualified for military service. And then there are other times that we see, like in 2 Samuel 5, that the lame are those who are able to actually defeat their enemies. What's going on there? Well, it's saying that God is going to fight for the lame, or it's saying that in a taunt, even our folks who are not able-bodied, in the same way you are, can defeat you in battle. So we certainly see that in the Old Testament as well. In Isaiah chapter 35, verse 6, or in chapter 3, verse 18, we see that the ultimate act of healing seems to be making the lame walk. Now, that's something that's happening here in Luke chapter 5. So there is this kind of identifier that Jesus is doing something that is expected of this messianic person that we see the prophet Isaiah hoping for, that this Jesus is demonstrating himself in this way as that Messiah. Rarely does Jesus just articulate, "Hey, I'm the Messiah, you guys need to follow me." It doesn't come out and say it that way, but it's more in the actions that are done. So then, the attendants of this lame man bring him to this home with Jesus, and that reminds me of some of the things that Fowler mentions in her text, having to do with these kind of ethical decisions or ethical dilemmas that we face. So these four friends bring the man on his bed. They can't get to Jesus, so what do they do with that? And I'm not suggesting that they went through, these questions that Fowler gives us. Is something illegal and morally impermissible? Is it illegal but yet morally permissible? Is it legal and morally impermissible? Or is it both legal and morally permissible? And it's interesting that when we balance all of these questions out with where they were, it's very possible that they're actually at Jesus' house. So the idea of, taking up this roof, which could be easily repaired, I'm not suggesting anything other than that, there may not be a great ethical or moral dilemma there for them, but they did face some kind of decision. What are we going to do about this? And how are we going to get our friend in front of Jesus, so that if there is a miracle to be performed, that can be done? It's interesting to note that at this time, they weren't the kind of progressive society that many of us think about and hope for today, where people like Martin Luther King has said are judged by the content of their character. So, there's a bit of a pariah nature or an outcast nature of being lame at this point in the world's history. And so these friends, these folks that are carrying this lame man on his bed, in some sense, we're pretty sure they're risking their own reputations. They're associating with someone who may have been, I'm not suggesting he was, but may have been a sinner in some way. I mean, that was one of the things, and certainly the article this week kind of teases that out a little bit. That's certainly one of the ways in which we could think about what's going on with this lame man. I mean, maybe he sinned. Maybe that's why he is the way he is, and it's really a problem, especially in our age when we think about why someone has a degenerative disease. I just don't even really think about sin or anything anymore. I think about genetics. I think about a host of other things, and yet in this time, in this place, they didn't see the world in the same way as I do in the 21st century. I don't fault them for that. It's just something to be aware of. So in some ways, if the lame man is an outcast for whatever reason, we have that with leprosy. Notice that is the leper that's healed right before, and leprosy is kind of a catch-all category. It's not necessarily Hansen's disease, but if they are associated with someone who's an outcast, what does that make of them? And of course, in the Old Testament, you have, and certainly in the New Testament as well, you have these cleanliness regulations and laws. So they risk their reputation. But in verse 20, notice what it says about Jesus. It says he sees their faith. And this is something that you see in across the triple tradition, that Jesus commends their faith in some way. And I realize that what I'm going to say, the direction I'm going to go with this, may be a bit of a stretch, but I'm kind of practicing a Jesuit interpretive technique here that causes me to place myself in the text. And the faith of somebody else, when I am compromised, is difficult to understate. The importance of which is difficult to understate. Sometimes the sick, the lame, the afflicted, it can't be optimistic, and they need somebody else to be optimistic for them. They need somebody to stand in the place of optimism. And I am not suggesting that any nurse, any physician, any technologist, any therapist would tell a patient, hey, you're going to get well. That's not my area. I don't pretend to be able to make that judgment. But there are ways to encourage people, even in difficult circumstances. Not to abandon hope, to create an environment where hope is possible for them, to stand with them, and to be an advocate, in a sense, to carry them on the stretcher when otherwise they would be left alone. So to kind of take this whole story and make it a bit of a metaphor, I really think there is power in that kind of encouragement that says, I'm going to carry you on the stretcher. And for some of us, that's a religious thing as well. But not just that. Sometimes I need somebody else to be an encouragement for me when I find it difficult to be encouraged on my own. And what we're not told is some of the backstory here. We're not told whether the paralyzed person says, hey, would you guys carry me to Jesus? I've heard this Jesus is in town, and I hear he heals people sometimes. Would you take me to him? We don't know that that's what was said. What is said is that Jesus commends their faith. It seems pretty obvious that it's the faith of those that carried the lame man to him. Maybe they took it upon themselves to tell him, their lame friend, look, Jesus is here. Let's get you over there and see what let's see what just might happen if we're in the right context, in the right place, at the right time.